To determine the domain and range, use interval notation. For both graphs, we'll assume the red dashed lines are horizontal and vertical asymptotes. We will also assume the graphs continue indefinitely. So let's go ahead and include arrows on both sides of the graphs. From here, recall the domain is the set of all inputs, which are often the x values, and the range is the set of all outputs, which are often y values. To determine the domain, we analyze the graph along the x-axis or horizontally. To determine the range, we analyze the graph along the y-axis or vertically. Starting with the first graph, let's determine the domain. Analyzing the graph from left to right, notice the graph continues to the left indefinitely without any holes or breaks, which indicates x approaches negative infinity. The graph continues to the right until it approaches the vertical asymptote of x equals 2. The graph never touches the vertical asymptote, and therefore x equals 2 is not in the domain. We make an open point at x equals 2. This indicates the domain is the open interval from negative infinity to positive 2. Remember, when using interval notation, it does need to be in the order of negative infinity, comma 2, not 2 to negative infinity. And also remember, the rounded parenthesis to the right of 2 indicates 2 is not in the interval. If it was included, we'd use a square bracket. And we always use parentheses for plus or minus infinity. And now for the range, we analyze the graph vertically, or along the y-axis. The lowest point on the graph appears to be where y equals 0, but again, the graph is approaching the horizontal asymptote of y equals 0, and therefore the function value never reaches y equals 0. 0 is not in the range. We make an open point at y equals 0. And then, of course, here we can see the graph goes up indefinitely, and y approaches positive infinity. This indicates the range is the open interval from 0 to infinity. And now let's look at the second graph. Starting with the domain, we analyze the graph along the x-axis or from left to right. We can see the graph goes to the left without any holes or breaks, which indicates x approaches negative infinity. And then the graph moves to the right and approaches the vertical asymptote, this time of x equals negative 2. The graph never touches the vertical asymptote, which indicates x equals negative 2 is not in the domain. We make an open point at x equals negative 2. The domain is the open interval from negative infinity to negative 2. And now analyzing the graph vertically, notice this graph goes down indefinitely without any holes or breaks, which indicates the range, or y approaches negative infinity. And the graph goes up until it approaches the horizontal asymptote of y equals 1. The graph never touches the horizontal asymptote of y equals 1, which indicates y equals 1 is not in the range. We make an open point at y equals 1. The range is the open interval from negative infinity to positive 1. I hope you found this helpful.